My name is Melissa Paulson. I'm with the Jago Center for Entrepreneurship, and the Jago Center, which is part of the Mendoza College of Business, and Fellow Irish Social Hub are the responsible parties for the Irish Impact Social Entrepreneurship Conference, which we started last night, and we're in the thick of things, and very excited to have our keynote speaker with us this evening. Before I talk about our keynote speaker and hand it off actually to the individual who's going to introduce him, we actually want to do a little marketing and talk about what Irish Impact is and what you can do as Notre Dame alums, affiliates, students, faculty, staff, and family to do to kind of get Irish Impact out into the to the domestic community and the international community. So Dan Morrison is our social media strategist, founder of Citizen Effect, and now consulting with other social enterprise organizations. And I'm going to ask Dan to carry it away.
How's everybody doing? Come on, one more time. How's everybody doing? Gotta get you fired up for David. So who here is Irish Impact? Who has Irish Impact? What is Irish Impact, right? So who here has done any volunteer work, any charity work, is a social entrepreneur themselves? Raise your hand. Okay, good. Hopefully everybody. It's because we're the Notre Dame family. So I was talking to Brendan the other day, about a month or two ago, and we're like, how do we actually mobilize the Notre Dame community around social entrepreneurship and social impact? And actually, it was more Brendan's idea than mine, so I have to give you credit for it. Yeah, exactly. So he's a little more bashful than me. So we came up with this idea for doing really short videos of people just telling us about themselves, just stating their name, stating their either class year or how they're affiliated with the university, and just quickly saying how they've had a great impact on the world. And we kind of have run into a little problem because some of the great social entrepreneurs here at Notre Dame have submitted videos, and they've done amazing things. Like Chris Ura, stands up and he did a great video, and he talks about founding Sustain You, which is 100% recycled apparel made by American workers, right? So that's a pretty high bar to hit. So we want to make it very, very clear to you that you don't need to have done something that great. You could literally have, done a lemonade stand and donated it to your local food bank or something like that. So I'm going to show you just a quick little trailer right here, and I'm sure Melissa will provide extra credit or something in her class for any student that creates one of these videos. But we would love everybody in this room to create a What's Your Irish Impact video. So take a quick look at this as your example, and I look forward to receiving all the emails at irishimpactnd@gmail.com. And there's a little contest that we're running. The video that gets the most views by the end of November wins. What, you're giving $1 million? Is that right? No, an iPad mini will go to the winner for the person with the most views. So without further ado, and maybe we'll play all the way, maybe we'll play halfway. Let's see.
Hi, my name is Ricardo Alvarez Diaz, class of 1995.
My name is Allie Weaver. I'm a junior at Notre Dame.
Hi, my name is Erin Fester, and I'm a senior at Notre Dame.
My name is Caitlin Crummett, and I'm a junior at the University of Notre Dame.
Hey, I'm Jan Pilarski. I'm a double domer.
And I'm Chris Tidmarsh. I'm Jan's son, and I'm co-founder of Greenbridge Growers.
And I'm Ryan Shepler, and we're Notre Dame students working as interns here in Guatemala with the Social Entrepreneur Corps.
I'm helping clients develop business plans to be approved for microloans through the Small Business Development Center.
We're a social enterprise that aims to reduce the destructive use of charcoal.
We're using the micro-consignment model to work with local entrepreneurs.
To find the cure to this mysterious ailment, Niemann-Pick type C.
I've been spreading my nonprofit foundation, Dreamcatchers, across the country in order to grant the dreams of hospice patients.
Greenbridge Growers is a social venture here in South Bend that grows fresh fish and vegetables using an innovative technique called aquaponics.
Every day our firm implements design decisions that save energy, promotes the adequate use and management of natural resources.
My group Esperanza has been in Nabat and Solola promoting stoves, trying to improve the cooking conditions of Guatemalans.
What's your Irish Impact?
What's your Irish Impact?
What is your Irish Impact?
What's your Irish Impact?
What's your Irish Impact?
So it's, whoa. Sorry. It's as easy as that. Who thinks they can do that? Come on. Come on. We do have cameras taking pictures everywhere. So that's you can see the production quality can be very, very low. It needs to be 30 seconds or less. And go ahead and email it to irishimpactnd@gmail.com. Thanks so much, and I look forward to listening to David soon.
So it's pretty simple, and thanks very much to Dan. And I'd like to introduce actually a good friend of ours, Greg Van Kirk, who some of you may know in the audience. Several of the students that were in that video actually interned with his organization this past summer, and there have been a number of students from Notre Dame who have interned with Community Enterprise Solutions and Social Entrepreneur Corps. Greg Van Kirk and his partner Bucky Glickley are going to be here tomorrow to talk to the students about what it's like to get one of these organizations up and running and the challenges, etc. And Greg, would you please come up on stage to introduce David?
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's always wonderful to be back here in many regards through our collaboration with Melissa and Frank and the students and so many here. This feels like my second university, so to speak. But it's really great to be part of this conference and to see so many people this year in this only second year of the conference. But I just wanted to obviously introduce David, and it is a true honor for me to introduce David. He's become a very good friend. And is my, whether he likes it or not, my informal advisor and mentor oftentimes. We share an office, and I'm always sticking my head in and saying, David, I've got an idea. Do you have an opinion about this? And he's like, I got it right, Greg. I got it right. Leave me alone. No. But just become a wonderful colleague. And I guess by way of introduction, I'd like to maybe tell a little bit of a personal story. And speak a little bit about how I think that relates to what he does and ideally what he's going to speak to. But in our work, we do a lot of, we're trying to get things to people in communities where they've never had access to solutions before, like water filters or cook stoves, as you saw in the video. And so we try to study psychology and behavioral economics and try to understand what is change making all about and how do people make decisions. And if you'll forgive me, there's a professor at Stanford who named B.J. Fogg, who has this formula that I think fits very well when we think about social entrepreneurship. And it's B equals M plus A plus T. And B being behavior, so behavior change, influence, change making, equals motivation plus ability plus trigger. And when I think about how I came into this field and how David has been such an influence on me, I used to work in the business sector, and I'd always thought that I would do something like this. And I had the motivation. I thought maybe I had some of the ability, but I didn't have a trigger. And then I read in 1999 the book The Price of a Dream, that David wrote about Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank. And that was really my trigger, because I saw that there was a way that you could take some business acumen and business skills, ideally, and try to make a contribution in the world. And so I quit my job and I moved to Guatemala, and it's all been a wonderful journey ever since. So I thank David for being my trigger and for writing that book. And as you all know, all of the great work that he's done since then, How to Change the World, which has really become the Bible in our field in many regards. And his Fixes column in the New York Times, he continues to offer insights and identify patterns and see what is it that really makes social entrepreneurship tick and share it with the rest of us. And I think that despite all of those accomplishments, what he's doing today with solutions journalism and trying to, in many regards, reinvent the way that journalists approach their work and that we as a society see journalism, ideally will really be a trigger that will have profound change that we'll be seeing for many, many years to come. So I think he's just getting started, and I think it's a wonderful time for you all to have him here. So a warm welcome to my good friend, David Bornstein.
Can I use this? Yeah, you can. Like this. I'm going to use this one instead of this one. I thank you, Greg. Greg is a truly wonderful human being. And my only problem with having him as an office mate is he makes me feel shorter than I am. My dad stays up late, and the best time to call him is usually around 11:30, midnight. He lives in Montreal. I live in New York. And typical phone call, the end of the day of work, and I'm turning off the computer. I call up my dad, and I go, "Hey, Dad, how you doing?" He says, "Dave, I'm convinced that animals are better than human beings." And I go, "Dad, you're watching CNN, aren't you?" He says, "Yeah." I said, turn it off. That's not really what the world looks like. It's a very false image of the world. So I'm constantly trying to get him to stop watching the news, and I send him the fixes columns instead. But this is really, I've been on, as Greg mentioned, I've been on this journey for 25 years now. I graduated from a business degree at McGill University in 1985. And really, my goal was just to go out into the world, make as much money as I could. I went into computers. I was going to start my own computer company. I did that for about 4 years because really my goal was to own a Jaguar. That was kind of it. And when I think back on that, I ended up leaving the computer world. I got restless. I traveled for a year backpacking. Then I got very interested in writing while I was traveling in Asia, started selling some articles. And over the course of time, I became a journalist, started covering sort of New York City as a beat reporter in Manhattan, and was covering crime and murders and the kind of politics that we're seeing today in the country right now. Actually, those sorts of stories. And it was quite depressing. And I remember thinking, oh no, I'm going to have to quit my second career too. And that's really when I heard about the Grameen Bank. A friend of mine just mentioned it to me, and I thought I would, just on a leap of faith, that it would be worth the experiment to go to Bangladesh, spend some time there, and see if this bank, which is lending money to women in villages that I had read about. At the time, it had about 500,000 women borrowers. Today, as many of you know, it has about 8 million, and it's lent about $10 billion. But at that time, really very little had been written about it. So I went there on a leap of faith, and I ended up spending a year in Bangladesh, over 2 years, and it really changed my sense of what's possible in the world. And over the past 20 years, I have been in this constant conversation with all of my friends and my father and other people to say, there's this extraordinary amount of problem solving in the world that we never hear about. It's not on our television sets. It's not in our newspapers. You could read the newspaper every day for 50 years and you wouldn't see much of it because it's not being captured. And yet there's this extraordinary landscape of social innovation that has bubbled up around the world. And there's this wonderful quote by a journalist named Walter Lippmann who said about 100 years ago, the way we imagine the world determines what we do with our lives. And it's very important to think about what that is, because the choices that we make, the careers we go into, the things we think are worth doing, come from our sense of what the world is like. And my main message is that the world is actually an extraordinarily interesting place now because of the amount of problem solving and the social innovation that's bubbling up. I mean, there are orchids coming out of cracks in the pavements all around the world. There are these wonderful ideas, and in many cases, if you hear these stories, your sense of possibilities changes. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to tell a few stories very briefly about some of the things that I've covered that the kinds of stories that make you think, wow, it's possible to solve social problems in a way that we sometimes think are impossible. And secondly, to look at really in a broader sense, if you pull back from 1, 10, 100, 500, 1,000 stories of how people are solving problems, are there patterns now in the way the world is emerging, the way the world is developing its sort of immune system towards problems? Is there something, are we getting smarter about social change? And I would argue that we're going through a kind of Enlightenment moment for very specific reasons in the way we're solving social problems. And things could be much, much better 20 years from now. I'm not saying they will be necessarily, but we have the capacity to solve a lot of social problems today that seem out of our reach. And then third, what's the relevance? What does it mean for any individual in terms of engaging in this field of social innovation? So, because I have a 10-year-old son, one of my favorite stories has to do with a program in Canada, out of Toronto, that teaches math to children. And as many of you know, put up your hand if you think you don't have the math gene. You just didn't get the math gene. You can admit it. Come on. Okay. Typically, I don't know what the exact statistic is, but about a third to a half of adults feel that they can't do math. And they're the people who give you the bill at the restaurant and tell you to add it up and figure out the tip and all that. And there's this sense that, we can't do math. And in fact, research shows that hierarchies develop very early in life, and the kids start thinking that they can't do math when they're in grade 1. They already have I'm a dummy idea about math when they're 6 or 7 years old. And this is crazy. And studies have shown that the kids who are at the lower end of that hierarchy actually get sick more often, believe it or not. It's not just a light thing to think that you're not that smart when you're that young. So this organization called Jump Math, I met this guy who founded it. His name is John Mighton. He's a remarkable person. He's won Canada's Governor General Award twice for Best Playwright. This is sort of a polymath, but he's also at the Fields Institute in Toronto, and he's done a PhD in mathematics. And he wasn't very good in math when he was younger. As a matter of fact, he got a D in his calculus when he was in high school. But he was always fascinated, and he loved numbers. He read a book it was a book by Sylvia Plath called Letters Home, where she described how she taught herself to write poems. And he said, if she can teach herself to write poetry, I can teach myself to do math. He read this when he was in high school. So while he was trying to support his playwriting habit, he became a math tutor. And he went to a local high school, and he said, a local middle school and elementary school, and he said, send me students who are struggling in math. The principal thought, he said, send me your students who have serious learning disabilities. And so she sent him a bunch of students who literally were 10 or 11 years old, but were doing math at the level of a 6-year-old. And he couldn't believe it. And there were some of these kids couldn't add two-digit numbers together. And over the course of a 10-year period, tutoring young people with very, very severe math disabilities, or what had been called disabilities, he was able to develop a curriculum that very gently scaffolded up these kids in terms of their mathematical learning. And what he did was he developed a methodology, and he said this to me, he said, people think that math is a cognitive skill. He said, math is actually learned through your heart. You have to come to feel that numbers are fun and playful things. And once you do that, you will learn it very quickly. The learning will happen. So you think this sounds sort of like pie in the sky sort of stuff. And he developed a curriculum that's very much like the way my dad taught me to play baseball when we were kids, which is basically you use a really big ball and a really thick bat, and you stand 2 feet away, and you make sure that the 3-year-old hits the ball, and then you take a step back, and eventually you have a happy baseball player. You can do that with mathematics. As a matter of fact, you can do it in math more easily than you can do in any other subject, because you can always break things down into finer steps. So he developed a curriculum that's based on this idea that we have to develop confidence as the primary goal of teaching math. That's the goal of the pedagogy. And he created a curriculum, and he started bringing that into schools. It's now in operation in about 10,000 classrooms across Canada. And it's actually gone through, it's one of the very few math curricula that's actually gone through randomized controlled trials, because John is a scientist and he wanted to see if he's really getting better results. For those of you who don't know how curriculum is chosen, it's chosen by publishers who want to sell thick books at the highest possible price. It's not chosen based on, there's no science behind math curriculum decisions. If your kid comes home with a math curriculum, you can guarantee it's just because some business person thought that's the one. They were the best salespeople to the local school district. It's not a scientific thing at all. So Jump Math has gone through these studies, and they found that actually it gets twice the rate of learning than the typical curriculum. It's gone through studies in England, in across Ontario, and in British Columbia in Canada. And it's now the Department of Education has actually invested in a study. I think the first time the U.S. Department of Education ever paid for a study outside the U.S. into a curriculum. I do not know if they are still paying for that right now. They may have stopped their funding temporarily. But the point is, when I called Isabel Grant, who's not Isabel Grant, the principal of Grant High School in Vancouver, and I asked her, how is this curriculum doing? She said to me, we have a problem. We grade our kids based on meeting expectations, not meeting expectations, and exceeding expectation. We don't have any kids in math anymore who are not meeting expectations, and the teachers are very worried because they're thinking, what's wrong? What do we do now? All the kids are learning math. And when you interview the teachers that are using this curriculum, they say that the bell curve has shifted way to the right. Everybody averages in the 90s on the tests. Now, this seems really impossible, doesn't it? But I've now interviewed about 20 different people, and they've had the same experience, and I've interviewed about 5 math teachers who say they're now quitting teaching, and they're going to help spread this model of math education through the heart because they think it could transform this hierarchy that develops very early in life where people self-identify as not good in math. And if you don't think that that's a really big social change, think about the mortgage crisis. Wasn't that a bunch of people who figured out they couldn't do math, right? It's a really, really major change. So I'm fascinated. I don't know if this curriculum, when it's spread and it's in the hands of hundreds of thousands of people, if it will still continue to produce the results it is proving. It might not, and that happens with many social changes. They're really good when they're small, but then when they get very, very big, they get watered down. But it's an extraordinary story when you think, because it actually shatters your idea of what's possible. I'll give you another example of that has to do with homelessness in the United States. There are there used to be, on average, on any given day in the United States, 125,000 people who were chronically homeless. And there's about 700,000 people on average any day who are homeless for some reason or another. But those are often families who are in between housing, or they're episodic homeless episode. But the actual hardcore homeless, the people that we think of as sleeping on the streets, is about 125,000. These are typically people, very often they're Vietnam vets, very often they're senior citizens. They typically have a mental illness or a drug addiction, and often a life-threatening illness like end-stage renal failure or something like that. Cities around the country have sort of, since the 90s, have sort of said, we can't really deal with this problem. And people, like in New York City, you just sort of walk by it. In San Francisco, you just walk by it. But there's an organization called Community Solutions that said about 10 years ago, isn't there a way that homelessness can actually be solved? Isn't there an approach? And they actually developed an approach. They worked with another organization that had developed an approach of getting people into permanent supportive housing, blanketing them with services, and it would actually work. And what would happen is this actually dropped the government's expenditures, because when somebody's in very reasonably expensive permanent supportive housing where they're getting the services, they can actually take insulin, so they're not in the emergency room because they have a fridge, right? They can actually deal with their health problems in a systematic way, and they're not ending up in the emergency room, and they're not ending up in the police police office, police station every night, which is extremely expensive when it gets into the courts. So they said, well, why don't we do this around the country? Why don't we create a blueprint for how this process works? And we'll put 100,000 homeless people, we'll take 100,000 people, and we'll put them into permanent supportive housing, and we'll do it by July 2013. So this sounds crazy, right? If you go to the 100,000 Homes campaign today, you'll see that they're at about 70,000. 70,000 people have been housed. Most of this in the past 2 years, just in the past 2 years, using a process that has been developed like an IKEA instruction set. First thing you do, step 1. What's the first thing you have to do? We need to find out exactly who these people are, and how do you actually move them into housing. So who figured out, what's the number one thing that you have to figure out when you're trying to sort of house homeless people on the street? Well, they asked a person, Betsy Canis, who went to West Point, who ended up joining the project, and she said, if we were doing it at West Point, the first thing we would do is we would identify our highest value targets. And we would make sure that we get the highest value targets off the street first, and then we would go to target 2 and target 3. And they said, well, how would you figure out who's the highest value target of a homeless person to put into housing? They thought about it, and they figured the person who's most likely to die soonest, who's still on the street, the person who has the most serious health problem, they're target number 1. The person who's trimorbid and who is unable to take their medication and is, really, a lot of homeless people actually die in their 50s. It's the life expectancy of a chronically homeless person is not much more than the life expectancy of someone in Bangladesh. So they developed this model, and they said, okay, how do we identify these people? We have to do what's called a vulnerability survey. How do you get a vulnerability survey? We have to get about a couple of hundred people, volunteers, to agree to go survey the homeless population. When do you do it? You have to do it between 4 a.m. and 6 a.m. because these are people who are living on the streets. And you have to go and you have to have a very simple conversation with them. Who are you? What's your problem? Can we take a photo of you? Here's a $5 coupon to eat at McDonald's. Okay, for your time. Thank you. And they've done this now. They've done this in more than 100 cities, and they've created vulnerability indexes. Then they get all the housing people around a table, and they say, okay, here's Maury, or here's Jimmy. He's a 62-year-old vet. He has renal failure. He's been living on the street for 19 years. He has a dog, and nobody will give him housing because of his dog. What can we do for Maury? And then everybody around the table, all the different departments get together, and they figure out which pot of money is available to deal with Maury or Jimmy's problem. And Maury then goes into permanent supportive housing. And this approach, it's not a perfect approach. It fails about 20% of the time. People leave the housing. But 80% of the time, it's working, which is actually much higher than people thought. And then tick by tick, each community is beginning to say, okay, we don't have homeless people anymore. Washington, D.C. used this model, and they increased their housing placement for homeless people by a factor of 10. There's only one person who actually is homeless who still lives in Times Square, New York. His name is Heavy. They've tried as much as they can to convince him to get off the streets, but Heavy wants to stay on the streets. So that's his decision. But pretty much everyone else there has been moved into housing, permanent supportive housing. So you think, wow, that's kind of interesting. Could you put a billboard outside the city saying, entering New York or entering Cleveland, a city with no homeless anymore? And then what does that make you think about? Well, our social services really work. Our government actually works. We actually dealt with the homeless problem. And why is it that how many people, put up your hand if you actually heard this story, if you've read it anywhere. Put up your hand. One, two, just two. Two people. Where'd you read it? Where did you read it? Yeah. Somewhere on the internet, okay. Somewhere on the internet is a big place. Okay, so now if you pull back from these two stories and you think about, what's going on in the world, you can extrapolate 100 stories like this or 500, and you imagine that your consciousness was filled with them instead of being filled with the government shutdown or the situation in Iran or the situation in Syria. Instead of only being filled or primarily being filled with what CNN gives you, you actually heard about all these adaptive responses. We would all be so encouraged. You'd wake up in the morning, you'd grab your iPad, and you'd say, let me go read the news. I want to find out how we're solving homelessness today or how we're fixing the foster care system today. So when I have interviewed social entrepreneurs who have created these really interesting models, and I think, how do you come up with your ideas? So if you wanted to sort of be a social innovator and you wanted to come up with your ideas, how would you? Where would you get these ideas? And I would say it's actually such a wonderful time to be alive if you like to fix things, because everything is broken, right? It's amazing. You look around you and you think it's an aging society, okay? We have all sorts of people around the country who don't even have access to healthy food. We have to retrain millions of people for jobs that they're not able to take. We have to retrain men. Women are doing actually much better. We have to retrain men, because men are doing a terrible time adapting from the job that they just got laid off from to the job that they need to spend 2 years training to get into. How do you do that? It's a really, really interesting question. Okay, we have to get into our education system and teach kids math through the heart, if that actually works better, and so forth. There's just so many opportunities now if you look around you. And I would encourage all of you to walk around with a pad in your pocket, and if you see a problem, say, opportunity. This is such a great time to be alive. There's just problems everywhere. So many institutions are broken. They're just not keeping up with what needs to happen. I had this experience just the last 2 weeks. I wrote 2 articles in the New York Times about how broken the healthcare system is, and in particular, how burned out doctors are, doctors and medical students. About 50, probably more than 50% of doctors say they're burned out, and 50% of med students say they're burned out by the time they finish medical school. Is anyone here a doctor? Put up your hand if you're a doctor. No doctors at Notre Dame. I hope you're all healthy. So this is a really enormous problem, and if you could read, if you want to go to these stories, I encourage you, because it's astonishing to read the comments that came in. Hundreds of comments from doctors talking about how miserable they are. I never knew doctors were so miserable. I knew that they were a little bit miserable. I didn't realize that they're traumatized by the health system that we have built. Now, if you're an energetic person and you like a little creative destruction, this is an absolutely great time to be alive, because the entire health system is going to have to be rebuilt. It is absolutely destroying doctors. It's destroying their motivation. 60% say they don't want their kids to go into medicine. You know, many of them say they want to quit, and we already have a doctor shortage as it is. Okay, how do we do this? What are the methodologies? What does the healthcare system of tomorrow look like? And if you pull back from these stories and you think, well, what are the patterns? How are people solving social problems in new ways? What are the patterns? Why am I calling this an enlightenment? You know, if I look at the math program, or like Jump Math, or you look at the way that homelessness strategy worked, and I could give you a bunch of other examples. How companies are much more systematically including disabled people and giving them good jobs that really fit with their abilities. How, for example, here's another really interesting model. It's called the transitional care model, and it connects hospitals with the home. It turns out that 1/3 of, if you are an elderly person and you go to the hospital, there's 1/3 of the time you're going to be readmitted within 3 months. Now, actually, that's unnecessary about half the time. Half the time, your mother or your grandmother or your grandfather, when they're admitted to the hospital, doesn't have to be readmitted within 3 months. It turns out most of the time that people are readmitted is because they have a problem that could have been avoided if a nurse just went and visited them at home and said, oh, your medications, we have to redo your medication because this doctor gave you the same medication and this doctor gave you another medication and they didn't talk to each other. Or you should really put a bar on this stairway because it's a bit dangerous here. If you go home with people after the hospital and you spend 24 or 48 hours just talking to them about their problems, it reduces readmission by 50%. You know how much that saves? That alone saves $4,000, just that one simple step. It's estimated that $10 billion could be saved from healthcare expenditures just by having a nurse make a 24 or 48 hour sort of on-call visit to a patient after they leave the hospital. Right? This is just one hospital, the University of Pennsylvania, that's done this. This has to happen system-wide. There's just such a great opportunity for anybody who likes to be a little bit, playful with systems and sort of destroy them creatively. If you pull back from all these approaches, you'll see that most of the innovations fall into 4 categories. And I've seen this over and over again, and this is why I kind of call it the Enlightenment. The first one is simply that people are using evidence to make decisions when they used to make decisions from the gut. It's basically Moneyball, right? Moneyball was the scouts said, he's got a good face, he's got a good look, he can throw the ball hard, I'm going to hire him. Then the guys with the laptop said, well, actually, this guy is the guy you should buy because he gets a ton of walks. The statistics show that he's really going to help your team get runs. And what we're seeing now over and over again is when people start looking at the data, they often find that their gut is wrong. Jump Math is an example of an evidence-based math program that shows that many of the assumptions in the way we teach math are just flat wrong. And your kids are getting the delivery of math instruction based on those false assumptions. The second really big pattern is just behavior change. That over the past 20 years, there's been so much new science in actually what makes people tick. The Obama campaign is probably the best example of this. They figured out exactly what message will get the person to turn up to vote. They would try 20 different messages, and they found out that the best message is not to tell people, we need your vote. You're the only one who hasn't, we need your vote because the old message was to try to guilt people into voting. The new message is, all of your neighbors have voted. You're the only one on the street that still hasn't voted. So the new message for cigarette smoking is not to tell people, quit or you'll die, but to tell people, if you quit now, in 3 months, you'll have 25% better lung functioning. And a year from now, your chances of having a heart attack are 50% less. Okay? So if you think what they've done is they've actually taken the behavior science and they said, oh, it's important to present people with aspirational models of behavior rather than fear-based models of behavior. If you quit smoking now, by the end of the summer, your lung functioning will be better. You'll be able to swim, perhaps. You know, it's an aspirational idea. And what we see, if you look at the field of social entrepreneurship, every single person who's doing something more successful in the health system, the education system, running businesses, delivering services in ways that are outperforming, they have actually taken this behavior change and they've adopted their systems to use the neuroscience and the science of evolutionary psychology and those sorts of disciplines. The third one is just finance. The biggest problem that we have in the United States with so many social goods is that something like early childhood education is so important. It's probably the best investment you can make, but it doesn't pay off while you're in office. And it doesn't even pay off while your successor's in office. It pays off 15 years from now, and you could care less because you want to see your shutter speed is the next election cycle. And it's only 2 years if you're in Congress. So how do you create incentives that are structured to get the things we should invest in to happen when people's timing is all wrong? Well, who does that sort of thing all the time? Finance. People who figure it out. The people who are figuring out things like social impact bonds. How do you actually shift the incentive so that this guy who needs to get paid off in the short term can get paid off in the short term and society will still make this long-term investment? How do you figure out who has a long-term interest and who has a short-term interest? And this is where all of you geniuses in finance have to figure out what are all the financial instruments that we need to invest in all of these social projects. Because right now, the way the government is functioning is it's all short-term stuff. The way businesses are functioning too is it's all short-term stuff. We need this kind of risk time shifting to happen systematically. And that is totally about creating these new finance mechanisms. And it's absolutely a totally exciting field. I speak to people in finance all the time who are experimenting with these kinds of models in the development world. You know, advanced market commitments and things like that. It's really interesting stuff. And the third thing is just integration. We have, you know, for those of you who have heard of Adam Smith, put up your hand if you've heard of Adam Smith. Okay. You haven't heard of homelessness, but you've heard of Adam Smith. Okay. So Adam Smith's favorite example was the first line is it's the division of labor that is where you get your power. You know, that's the division of labor is the greatest source of productivity gains and advancements. And so what we saw in the 20th century is the evolution of pin factories across the world and across society. And a pin factory is something that's very specialized. We just do health. We just do housing. We just do the after-school piece of it. We just do the youth coaching piece of it. And we have all sorts of pin factories around society. And then suddenly into the pin factories walks a human being with whole needs. I'm a 9-year-old kid, and I have asthma, and I'm ending up in the emergency room once a month. Well, it turns out if you have asthma, what's the single biggest thing that has to change in order for you to get out of asthma, or in order for you to not have these attacks? The number one thing, your housing. Your housing is the prime reason that poor kids get asthma. Usually it's dirty, cockroach-infested housing. Maybe the window doesn't close because nobody can get the landlord on the phone and it's always cold in the winter. If you speak to anyone who works in an urban hospital and they tell you what's the single number one thing you could do to improve public health in this community, they won't even say it has nothing to do with the hospital. It has nothing to do with health insurance. It's housing. It's the social determinants of health. So how do you deal with these problems when you have all these pin factories? So what you see if you look at all these social entrepreneurs is that they're beginning to integrate things. They're beginning to create shopping centers kind of things. They're pulling functions together. One of my favorite examples is an organization called Health Leads. And there's another example called the Doctor-Lawyer Partnership. They both basically do the same thing. If you go into a hospital and the pediatrician looks at your child and says, I'm going to prescribe Ventolin for the asthma, but I'm also going to make a social prescription, and I'm going to say that this child needs a fresh air experience, probably a swimming program, reduce dairy in his diet, and get rid of the cockroaches. Now, the pediatrician cannot fill those prescriptions, but they have created these things called family help desks within the wards of the hospitals. And the social prescription, it's literally a pad. It sits on the desk. It's the social prescription. It's actually a form, goes right into the electronic medical record, and that social prescription gets filled by the health leads, and they tend to be, they're college student volunteers. So the students literally get on the phone, and they call up the landlord, and they say, I'm calling from this medical center. We need to talk about fixing the window and cleaning up the cockroaches because this child is getting sick all the time. And they're quite successful at doing this. They have lots of resources. They know how to use legal services and so forth. And they actually complete the clinical care for the child who went into the emergency room. It's absolutely brilliant. And now it's in the electronic medical record that the doctor prescribed the medication and the family help desk prescribed the social part of the cure. And this is now operating in about 30 different hospitals, 25 hospitals around the country. But it absolutely has to become, sort of the standard. So if you think about the brilliance of integrating care in that way and how much more impact you have, and then you pull back at all of these things that we talked about, the evidence, using evidence, really recognizing that people are totally irrational. The whole rational actor model of man is completely false. We are not rational at all. But we can understand how to work with people and how to modify behavior, right? We can integrate functions, much more successfully than we have in the past, and we can figure out finance mechanisms that get governments to really do the things that they should do by coming in with much more creative risk shifting. And you see this all across the board. Innovations, if you actually look at those 4 patterns, I bet that there's 100 business models or nonprofit models that could emerge from those just by looking at the problems you see. So that's sort of the Enlightenment moment, and I think we are moving away from bloodletting to germ theory, in a sense, vis-a-vis social problems, and it means that we're much more powerful towards these problems. So we don't have to look back on the great society and say, oh, we had all these high aspirations, but we weren't able to fulfill them, because in fact we actually are getting smarter about solving these problems. So it's a really exciting time to be involved in social change. So the last thing I want to finish with before getting into some questions is just the most important thing if you are interested in being a social innovator, and put up your hand if you think I want to be a social entrepreneur, I want to actually have a social innovation kind of career path. Put up your hand. That's a lot of you. That's a lot of people. That looks like about 60%. That's phenomenal. I graduated from college in 1985, and this was not even on my radar. Okay, the single biggest, from my perspective, key to success is basically understanding at a very deep level what is your way of causing change. What is your way? Everyone has a different way of causing change, and the person on the magazine cover or the person who just spoke to your class who's a social entrepreneur, their way of causing change is not your way. There's no one way to do it. But there are ways to think about what your place in the world is. And I would give, sort of a simple analysis. I would draw 3 overlapping sort of Venn diagrams so that in the middle, the 3 of them overlap. And in one of them, talk about your personal preparedness. That's all the things you've done to prepare. That's your temperament, the kind of person you are. That's your constraints, whether you have to continue to help support your parents. All of the things that talk about your skills, your talents, your ability, your preparation, and whether you're an introvert, extrovert, those things. That goes in one big bubble. That's you. The next bubble is basically social need. Ideas or needs that you've recognized really matter and you care about. That's social need. And the third one is historic opportunity. What has changed recently? What is changing now that makes it newly realistic and possible to actually do something vis-a-vis a problem? And those changes, they can have to do with demographics, they can have to do with new market realities, with technology. In my case with journalism, the business model of journalism is falling apart. So people are willing to talk about solutions journalism today when 10 years ago they would have booted us out the door because they were closed to that idea. So that's a historic opportunity that means it's now possible to change the field of journalism. It's possible to change the field of healthcare now because everybody is unhappy. Nobody, except for the insurance companies, nobody likes healthcare. The patients, the doctors, the nurses, everybody's miserable. So if you do that analysis, the you gets in the center. The way I can have my change is an overlap of those things, and that's a way of reducing from the 1,000 possibilities down to 10 or 20 possibilities that can give you a way of looking forward. It's important to know also whether you're an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur, whether you like to work inside things. An entrepreneur is someone who changes the system from within but is not starting their own thing. Whether you're an MVP. You know, I grew up in Montreal, and my favorite trophy in hockey was always the Hart Trophy, the MVP. The most valuable player. Sometimes it was Bob Gainey, who only scored 6 goals for the Canadiens one year, but he made the whole team work. Lots of people are MVPs. They're not the stars, but they actually make other people more powerful. If you're an MVP, that's a really powerful role to play. I would venture to say a lot of people think they want to be entrepreneurs, but they're really MVPs. And if you're an MVP, know that about yourself, because it's powerful information in terms of how you choose tasks. And then finally, my last point is just Clinton said, when it's about the economy, stupid. I really think when you think of social entrepreneurship, it's really about meaning, stupid. It's in the sense that the thing that makes people succeed when you're trying to solve social problems is durable motivation. That's the one thing that is the only ingredient that if you don't have, you guaranteed you cannot succeed. You have to have durable motivation. So you have to ask the question, where does durable motivation come from? What is the thing that I can reasonably say about myself that I'm interested in today that probably 20 years from now I'll still be interested in? I can't see myself letting go of this core interest of mine. Now that's a very, very personal question. How do you mine for those kinds of things? I would say that connecting to that motivation and trying to understand that and doing a personal inventory is a very, very powerful thing to do, because this is this is a marathon journey, and those answers do exist. Most of the people I've interviewed over the years who have started or created pretty powerful movements, you can find the seeds of the interest oftentimes when they're in elementary school or high school. You can see that they started a club when they were 8 years old. They found interest. And so you can do a sort of a personal, find your sort of the narrative continuum in your own life. And that often is a very powerful predictor. Because burnout is often just, people, you don't come up with an idea when you're 30. You may act on that idea when you're 30, but you may have been sitting on the idea and mulling around for 15 years. And that's very powerful to know about yourself. And the last thing is just, I speak to a lot of college students today, and they all, I say, what's your biggest fear? And they say, will I get a job when I graduate? That's my biggest risk. And my sense is that for most people in this room, financial risk is probably not the biggest risk. When we talk about risk, most of the time when we read about it in the newspaper, we think of financial risk. My 401k has gone down the tubes. Health risk, I might get sick. Security risk, what happens if the terrorist blows up the bus or something. But the risk that is most real for most people, and the majority risk, is really just the risk of gutting your soul, I guess you could say. It's basically doing something for 40 years that doesn't turn you on. That's just existential risk. That's just missing life. And it's interesting to me, as I've spoken to more and more people and interviewed these social innovators, what I found is that they have no tolerance for existential risk, but they're willing to, let all those other risks happen. See what happens without making a lot of money and feeling that anxiety financially and all that. But they're not willing to let go of doing something that makes them feel very alive. I don't know why that is. Sometimes it has to do with parenting. Sometimes it has to do with just the idea that someone else gives you, that it's possible to live a life that aligns your deepest values, your interests, what you're good at, and have a real impact and work with colleagues who you love. It's possible to have all that. So people don't often talk about that. That to me is a very flourishing and joyful life. And so I just offer that to you as a possibility that I've seen expressed many, many times. And thing to me that I found most moving about this work is how people connect to that. So I'm going to end with 2 quotes, and then we'll have some questions. So I love this one. This is from Emerson. A great part of courage is the courage of having done the thing before, which is to say that you don't have to have a lot of courage when you start something. You will get a lot more when you go. And then finally from Mark Twain, my life has been full of terrible misfortunes, most of which never happened. So good luck and have fun. Thank you very much. Switch the mic. So fire away with questions. How much time do we have, Melissa? 20? A little bit.
What's the most significant outcome you'd like to see from this conference, Irish Impact?
That's a good question. It's action. It's something actually happens, or real things happen, and so and how do you get to that? I think a follow-up very, very quickly before the energy dissipates that brings together a core group of people who are actually doing stuff or breaking up into groups that have very clear action dimensions to them. But right away, if you don't do it within like 24 hours, it's gone. Yeah.
Smaller scale. You talk about things working well at smaller scale, but when it gets broad, they get watered down. Can you talk a little bit more about that and give some examples of hints you've seen that might not be that way?
Yeah, I mean, the classic example would be a program like Head Start, for example. If you look at a lot of social programs, they start, and the pilots are very powerful, and they have tremendous evidence, and then they get rolled out sometimes through a bureaucratic apparatus. And, it's kind of like making, remember we used to record from a tape to a tape to a tape? Well, by the time you got to the 5th one, you could not even hear the music anymore. It's kind of like that. You lose that. So the question is, how do you have faithful replication or faithful renewal at scale? The opposite, if you look at a company like McDonald's, which is, to tell you the truth, I'm not a huge fan of McDonald's, but they know how to actually maintain and actually improve quality as they grow. Because if you look at the oldest franchises, they're the ones that are the worst now. They still can't get rid of their old habits, but the newest ones, have all the gizmos. And if you look at the newest branches of the Grameen Bank, the ones that are the 2000th branch or the 2100th branch, they're the best ones. They're the most modern. They have the best ideas. It's the oldest branches that have those old behavior problems that they still can't get out. So what creates an upward spiral of getting better as you grow, and what creates the dilution effect? And I would say that basically, you could almost say that that's the definition of entrepreneurship, is grow. Entrepreneurship is a process by which things grow and improve. I mean, I would say, and there's no simple answer for that. It's constant iteration, it's constant renewing, it's culture of excellence, it's communication. I mean, there's no one thing that goes into that question. But I think, that's really one of the cores. And from my research, and there's a lot of people here, I'm sure, who are experts on entrepreneurship. I'm not a management scientist, but from the research I did when I was writing How to Change the World, the thing that really stuck with me was that the key to the success of the most successful entrepreneurs was not talent, it was not brains, it was that they were incredibly systematic. They were the most systematic in the way they addressed problems, and they tended to be the most successful. So it appears to me that systematic breaking things down and being detail-focused is very, very important to that upward spiral process.
You spoke about durable motivation and also the willingness to take existential risk. When I think about some of the greatest social innovators, call them Dr. Martin Luther King, Bishop Desmond Tutu, the sources of that motivation and that willingness to take that existential risk was their religious faith. So I'm interested in your research and your stories. Have you come across any belief, any statistical evidence that maybe religiously motivated organizations perform better at affecting impact?
You know, I don't know about organizations, but I had a very interesting, I participated in a very interesting gathering of 50 social entrepreneurs who met at this Skull World Forum in Oxford and discussed their faith and how it informed their work. And it really resonated what you're saying. It was extraordinarily powerful to see how everyone in the room drew very deep from that well. Because the process is, you know, there's a lot of doubts. Oftentimes you try things, and then it doesn't work at all, or you made things work, or the kids didn't show up, or after all this energy, the foundation called and said, sorry, we're not actually making the grant. I mean, there's all sorts of disappointments. So where do people get that strength from? And I have found, I can only think of one person that I've ever interviewed of about 500 who said absolutely faith plays no role in her sense of strength. And but I think that she actually has a faith in her not having faith. So there's. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts, and I don't expect you to have like an actual answer to this, although it was so impressive to do, on a societal solution to this Kardashian complex of that we would prefer to consume the Post every day as opposed to the Times, that we'd rather read all the snippets on the, you know, latest gross sleazy politician or crime rather than solutions to problems and feel-good stories. Do you think it's that's what we're fed, or do you think that's what people seek out? And is there a solution to turning the tide?
I'm glad you asked that. There's this thing called solutions journalism, which is incredible. No, I'm serious. My colleague just pointed out to me. She said, "Do you realize that we have been on the most emailed list of the New York Times consistently for the last 7 weeks? We're actually number 1 last week, number 2 this week, number 3 last week, number 1 the week before of most emailed stories. And these are stories that are pretty wonky, nerdy stories about social change. So why do I think solutions journalism? And I'm being realistic. Why do I think it's actually? I don't know if it'll beat out Miley Cyrus. 90% of gossip is negative. It's about the misdeeds of others, and you could almost argue that gossip evolved out of an evolutionary need to warn people about danger, about people not to trust, essentially, which was a survival type of thing. So putting that aside, what is the most popular storytelling genre in the world? The thing that outsells Miley Cyrus by a lot. What's the most popular story? Who can just guess it right off the top? Harry Potter. Exactly. And Harry Potter, I was actually going to say the detective story, but Harry Potter is a very good example of basically, this is Harry Potter. I read all 4,000 pages out loud to my son, joyfully, and you cannot put the book down. It's like 9:30 and it's bedtime, but let's just read one more chapter. Why? Because how's Harry going to solve this problem? Harry's in a mess. How's he going to get out of this? Hermione's in a mess. How's she going to get out of this? Oh, no. Right? You turn on the TV, you watch House. You watch the first minute of House. Oh, how's the doctor? Sherlock Holmes going to solve this medical mystery? It's 1 a.m. and I have to go to sleep, but I still have to watch the next 59 minutes because I watched the first minute. It's the same thing with the detective story, Agatha Christie. They're all the same thing. They're all howdunits, right? They basically hook you with curiosity, and you stick around. You want to know, how did this problem get solved? Well, we're now talking about these extraordinarily interesting social problems. How do you reduce the dropout rate in a high school? How do you make sure that kids don't revolve in and out of the hospital for these things? These are really interesting challenges. And if you frame them and write about them as howdunits, if you use this extraordinarily contagious, globally interesting, probably biological narrative structure, which is problem-solving structure, you can make this stuff incredibly interesting. And the reason why journalists historically have not done that is because they think, oh, the conflict is the argument. these guys deny global warming. These guys think it's the worst thing that's ever happened. Let's put them together in a story. We have conflict. Every story has to have conflict. That's what we need. But the conflict in the problem solving is the problem. It's the tension between the person who has a goal and how difficult it is to move this goal along, to achieve this goal, because there's vested interests and force of habit and the unions. And whoever the bad guys are, or the charter school people, or whoever your bad guy are who are trying to block your thing, and that's when you lean in and it gets really interesting. So we feel very strong. I'm a bit of an evangelist on this. We think that helping journalism discover the joys of the howdunit will make it much more interesting and popular for people to be reading about important things in an engaging way. So. We did it. It's called the Solutions Journalism Network, and we now have a team of 8, and we are working with newsrooms around the country now to institutionalize a rigorous practice of solutions journalism. We're doing an 18-month project with the Seattle Times, where they're doing solutions journalism about education for 18 months. Which is supported by a foundation. We are working with the Pulitzer Center. We're developing the first solutions journalism curriculum. We've created funds that are like the fund from investigative journalism, which are the fund for solutions journalism, where journalists can apply for funding to write solution-oriented stories. And we now have about 25 newsrooms around the country, top ones, including the stuff we're doing at the New York Times, to try to demonstrate this journalism, to show that it's both popular and serious, and also a really fun thing for journalists to do, because most journalists, they're as unhappy as doctors. So that's why when Greg walks out of his office and he says, "Dave, can I ask you a question?" I'm like, no. We're doing the Solutions Journalism Network stuff. Thank you for asking about
that. You mentioned you worked in computers after graduation. How much of an impact did that have into pursuing later social innovation in journalism and social innovation? And what would you say to an undergraduate student about to graduate in between going to the traditional path of a firm or a company in the for-profit world and then going to the social innovation world, or going straight out of college?
Yeah, so I wouldn't have a specific answer about which path to take, but I would say I think the process is this. I think most people, this is again my opinion, most people I think edit their lives before they've written them. They start narrowing down too soon. I mean, it's there are some people that truly are I've met them in the developing world. They don't really have that many degrees of freedom. But a lot of American college people have much more degrees of freedom than they often think. So what I would do is I would do this. I would say, I would sit there with some friends and I'd go through a brainstorming process who really know you well, and try to come up with your dream job. 10 or 15 years from now, if you were as my son says, if you were the boss of the world, what would you be doing 15 years from now? And that would be the fullest expression of you in the world, having the most impact and the most fun. And picture that. Put it up there. It's like the Buddhist thing. Begin with the end in mind. Have that idea. Talk about it. Where would you live? What would it feel like? What would you be doing? How early in the morning would you wake up? Really flesh it out and picture that. And then say, okay, who are the 5 people that I probably met along the way that really helped me to get there? Who are those 5 people? They were my mentors, my great teachers. And try to figure out who they were. And if possible, try to get their names. Really put down their names. And then the next thing is how are you going to meet those 5 people? How are you going to actually call them up and ask them to take them to lunch and sit down and learn at their knees? Through a process like this, you can plan your serendipity. Life is not, you cannot really plan a life. But you can actually, it's like if you want to marry an engineer, go to engineering parties and date engineers. I mean, it's really simple, right? So if you want that dream job, do the things that are likely to take you there. You're still going to have chance along the way, and people are going to push you left and right in different directions, and opportunities will come. But people don't plan their serendipity enough. I mean, when I decided, 20-some years ago that I wanted to, wouldn't it be amazing if I was writing a column in the New York Times about something I totally loved and was passionate about? That would be like my dream job. And I thought, well, what are some of the things that I have to do along the way? What do you have to do to get that job? You have to write a couple of books. You have to have an expertise in an area that distinguishes you pretty early in your career that other people aren't doing, i.e. go to Bangladesh. You know, there's a way to actually think through in a systematic, deliberate way how you can actually move forward in life, totally acknowledging the winds of fortune will push in different directions too. And I meet very few people who actually even believe that, one, it's possible to live a life with planned serendipity, and then two, go through that process of actually trying to make it happen for themselves.
You spoke about community solutions, and about community solutions as an example of people moving out of kind of the more siloed approach into more of a collective approach. Can you speak to examples, particularly in this case dealing with poverty, housing and poverty and homelessness, where it wasn't just housing groups coming together, but groups perhaps moving all along the spectrum. So housing plus workforce development plus counseling plus, you know, the range of holistic services necessary to sustainably move someone out of poverty into a better life.
Yeah, those examples are not. They're fewer and far between in the United States than they are in the developing world, actually, because it's sort of illegitimate to have a conversation about health in a country like India without talking about poverty or housing. I mean, people would just sort of laugh you out of the room. So you see a lot of that in the developing world, where whole communities are coming around a whole variety of. I mean, Greg's work does that. You know, they look at economic livelihood, they look at health, they look at housing, they look at all of these things because it all hangs together. In the United States, a good model that's worth looking at is this model that's been called collective impact, and the leading sort of proponents of that model in the country is an organization called the Strive. I think it's called the Strive Collaborative, but it was out of Cincinnati initially. I think they've moved offices, but they now have identified around the country, I think it's about 80 or 90 examples of what they call collective impact. And this is where a bunch of people in a city get together and they say, we are going to join forces, particularly around education. So it starts with the United Way and the early kindergarten readiness, all the way up to the people who are doing college access, and then a college to career pipeline people. And they really literally get them around a table, and they figure out, okay, how do we work together so that there's pipelines? It's kind of like, you know, how when you board an airplane and your bag gets off, hopefully it arrives in the city you're going to, like 10 people may have touched it. Who are the 10 people that have to touch this child so they go from age 3 to a nice career? And let's get them all in the room and figure out if they can talk to each other. Are they doing meaningful things together? Are they using the same data sets to try to evaluate success? That's a really good thing. Are they counting the same things? Is there a way that they could count the same things? That process is now being tried in a lot of cities. Some of them are very advanced along the way, and they've done it quite well. They have scorecards and everything, and others are just beginning. You can do that with fisheries, too. There's some examples of places that are doing that with value chains for sustainability, value change, and things like that.
Are there like 2 or 3 social entrepreneurs that you've interacted with that maybe none of us know about that you think would be a great model for us and the students?
For the students?
Yeah, just something like maybe social entrepreneurs that may not Muhammad Yunus, but others that you think are doing great things that maybe we don't know about that we should know about.
Yeah, I would say other student innovators. You know, I mean, I think the work of, say, for example, Health Leads, which grew out of universities and is still largely staffed by volunteers, is a great model because it shows. It started as an experiment by a student who just went to a hospital in Boston and said, "Can I hang out in the pediatrics ward and see if I can help out?" And it grew into this. I think there's an organization called Lift Communities, started by a young woman named Kristen Lodel, where they actually also do a similar thing. They bring in lots of college students, And they teach them essentially a methodology of providing social services that help move people into housing or into careers. This is basically kind of like the nice social services as opposed to the social service that you might go to in your hometown where they give you a number and don't talk to you for 3 hours and are not very friendly. So this is kind of like a wonderful example of what social services could be if they were run in a humanistic way. Lift communities, I would say. I look at the Genocide Intervention Network, which was founded by a bunch of students from Swarthmore a number of years ago, and they developed a very savvy political strategy when initially during the presidency of George W. Bush, to move legislation to provide funding for peacekeepers in Darfur during the genocide there. And they have since developed a number of very savvy political organizing tactics that have a lot of teeth to them. And once again, I mean, I really thought that these students were brilliant in the way that they said, we have to figure out how to get this bill, out of the committee and onto the floor. It turns out that one particular senator at the time was holding it up. He happened to come from Indiana. I won't mention his name. And it turns out that 5 of his top funders needed to be called to get him to make the decision to move the Darfur Peace and Accountability Act to the Senate floor. So there's a very, very savvy, great exposure for people how the political system actually works and how much more power you have as a citizen than you know. Oh. What are you doing for dinner?
You also mentioned about business models. Are you familiar with Mohammed Yunus's concept of non-loss, non-losing enterprise?
Yeah. So there's a subset of entrepreneurs, of business people who will totally get it. And these are people who there's so much context behind that idea. This is an idea that Mohammed Yunus has defined social enterprise not in a very different way from the way everybody else defines it. He doesn't say it's doing well by doing good, like you can make a lot of money, become rich, and also solve problems. He says you can create a company that basically earns a very small 1%, no more, or is totally a break-even company to solve a problem. He doesn't really think that the profit motive has to be baked into that at all. And he says, and for a certain percentage of people, that will work. Now, when I first heard that idea, I thought, he's not going to get too many people to adopt that idea because people think, business, I need to make money. But then I was thinking recently, I thought, if a historian was writing the headline of the past 50 years, and they had to figure out what headline to write on everything that's happened in America over the past 50 years, like sum it up in one statement, it might be something like the failure of our success. Which is to say, this extraordinary wealthy country that managed to do this unbelievably dreamlike thing of creating a level of consumption and comfort that was unthinkable to our grandparents, who are depressed, anxiety-ridden, fearful, and have created systems like the health system that just make them miserable at all levels. And you think, well, this is kind of in some ways what has been produced over the past 50 years by a model that says we can consume our way to happiness. So I think Mohammed Yunus might be right in the sense that we can actually bring happiness to ourselves through meaningful pursuit and have a decent life too. And he's basically saying don't have to maximize profit at all. So I think he'll get more and more takers over the years, but he's a good salesperson.
Last question.
How are we doing? Last question?
Hi, over here.
One more? Yes, sir.
I just want to say, David, thanks for talking with us. It's been really interesting to hear more about, hear your stories, and so thanks for sharing.
Thank you.
I work for Univision News, and I've had the experience.
Univision?
Univision, yeah. Of being in a newsroom setting, and I focus a lot on our social initiatives, and and talking to the reporters and producers, and it's so hard to get people sometimes out of that breaking news or that daily news mindset. What has your experience been like when you're taking your initiative to newsrooms around the country, and what kind of success are you having?
So it's very mixed. In a breaking news context, it's hard. Solutions journalism does take more time. It takes more time to write about solutions because you have to really find out if there's evidence, if they're really working, and if so, what's different about them. So you're not just covering what happened, you're actually going into it. So it's more like an enterprise piece of reporting, which requires more resources. So in the breaking news context, it's hard for people to just do it right away. But if you talk to people and say, what are your long-term editorial coverage? What are the issues that you want to dig into over the course of the next year, and have something really meaningful to say about something that's really important to your viewers or your listeners. Very often they'll say, well, yeah, we actually want to sort of go deeper into this sort of thing, and we're always trying to figure out how we can come at this from a fresh angle. And then you say, oh, well, we can actually give you a technique of looking at data and looking at things that are on the ground that will completely blow your mind, in the sense that you'll suddenly realize hundreds of stories you haven't thought about. We call them positive deviants. If you're covering healthcare, the typical journalist will look at the hospital with the worst patient safety record and go there and try to get the CEO of that hospital fired. That's classic watchdog journalism. But you could also say, well, over here, 3 miles away, there's a hospital. Your hospital cesarean rate is 49.4. Over here, with a similar demographic, their hospital cesarean rate is 18%, 18.9%. These are actually two examples I'm thinking about in Long Island. You now have an interesting story. Here's a positive deviant. How did this hospital do so well when the other one did so poorly? And you have this very interesting frame. And what the story ends up being is a how-to story about how one hospital managed to do something really interesting. And they usually probably had a lot of good ideas there, and something happened there to make it change. And at the same time, you're pointing out that there's this big range. And what you can do is you can frame so many stories like that, they become so much more interesting to read. It's more light and not all tunnel, which is what people are always saying when they say, I can't watch the news, it's just too depressing. And why shouldn't you be reporting on the hospital that's outperforming the norm? Isn't that important to know about? I mean, should we only spotlight? It's like, if we were parents, would we just criticize our kids every morning so they become better people? It's crazy, right? You have to identify opportunities, interesting things. It's so much more powerful to notice truth-telling than to punish lying if you want to have a kid who tells the truth. It's way more powerful. So why don't we do that and feedback systems in business and all that, they prove that out, that an effective feedback mechanism makes somebody feel bigger when they walk out, makes them feel more powerful when they walk out the door. So why don't we do that with our major feedback mechanism, which is journalism? And I think it's a message that after a while it begins to sink in. We found that we have to put resources on the table too. Money always helps. And say that we can give you some runway to do some reporting in these areas if you really want to do it, so that you get used to it. Because it's an identity and it's a habit among journalists. And it's hard to change habits. Thank you very much. The questions were great. Thank you. Thank you.